The emergency shutdown of airports across the U.S. and Canada brought 6 flights to Edmonton. It brought Californian Bart Moore and his family. His heart was with fellow Americans. His anger was towards whoever would commit this unprecedented act of terrorism.
You got to send a message to these people. You can't let these people do things that they do like this. If they do this, what are they going to do? Your country could be next. What would your country do in a situation like this?
That very blanket of security that brought American-bound flights here stopped U.S. citizens from making it out of Edmonton today. Like so many who heard the news for the first time, a big-game hunter from Colorado was raw with emotion.
I'm speechless. I can't talk to you guys.
The scope of the unprecedented attack finally overcomes Greg Juflis. The risk of continued airborne terrorism still a big enough gamble to keep the international closed until further notice. For the American-bound travelers, that could mean a layover of up to 2 days. Their memories of this place forever linked with one of the most horrifying days in modern history.
I'm stunned, and to have a loss of life has been incredible. Jesus.
And tonight we have those 1,200 people who have been brought to Edmonton, not knowing where they'll stay in our city, not knowing much about our city at all. I'm joined by Tracy Bednard of the Edmonton Airports. Tracy, where are those passengers being put up tonight?
We worked very early with different airlines and service providers here at the airport to ensure that we provided a coordinated effort to get all of those passengers from the international airport into accommodations. So we've done so. We actually met each passenger as they were being processed through Canada Customs and Immigration to provide them with assistance in getting to their hotel room. We've started with hotel rooms that are closest to the airport and fanned out into the city of Edmonton from there.
Other than those 6 flights, those emergency flights that landed here today, we had about 220 incoming and outgoing flights canceled. Tell us about some of the security concerns you had today.
Certainly, the most important thing to communicate is that we are part of a national airport policy currently. We are working under the directive and instructions of Transport Canada. Part of their information and requirements of our airport is to increase our security level here at the airport. What that really means is that we have no people, that means no airport personnel, nor do we have passengers who are in the secure areas. So that's the hold rooms and that type of thing, for example. In addition, we ceased any upgrades, renovations, construction activity on the air side, just to help with security measures.
The most important question for all these people stranded in Edmonton and for Edmontonians as well is, when is our airport and all of our airports up and running again?
Well, you know, unfortunately, that's not a question that Edmonton airports can independently answer. As I said again, this is certainly bigger than just our airport. We're working cooperatively within an entire airport system, and we'll be looking to Transport Canada for information on that as the, in the hours to come.
Okay, and we'll keep posted on that as it becomes available. As we say, Daryl, 1,200 people diverted to Edmonton as an emergency procedure with the closure of American airports. Daryl, back to you.
All right, thanks. David Owasiga with a live report tonight. Of course, other Canadian citizens also welcoming foreign passengers today. There were 10 diverted jets that landed in Calgary. Further north, 2 Korean-based jets landed in Whitehorse. That created some security concerns today. Those jets were actually escorted by fighter jets from a U.S. Air Force base in Alaska. One of the airline pilots had activated an emergency transmitter because they were low on fuel. But there was a communications mix-up, and air traffic controllers thought there was a hijacker on board. After landing, RCMP cleared the plane and they found no evidence of any hijacking. Foreign affairs officials say that all border crossings between Canada and the United States are closed because of today's terrorist attack. Officials are on high alert and police are being asked to help customs agents look for anyone or anything suspicious of trying to cross the border. The Alberta border crossing into the U.S. is at Coots, just south of Lethbridge. Edmonton Garrison responding to the tragedy this hour as well. The forces instituted a recall. That means anyone on leave in the area must return to the base. Personnel must also be prepared to react on tasking, such as supporting American services. On the base, security measures are under review. They could be heightened, and the emergency runway is also being cleared off just to be on the safe side.
We may have to check for ID when people come onto the base. We may have to restrict access to the base, but we're only in a prepare mode for that.
Those extra precautions in place just in case the international airport actually runs out of space for diverted flights. Well, certainly the wave of terror in the United States has reached Edmonton in many ways. People across our city have felt the impact of those attacks. Sheldon Larman joins us live from City Hall area. Sheldon, there was a real scare down there this afternoon in high tensions.
It started out as a threatening phone call to the mayor's office, Daryl, and you can see police and bomb squad members are still working on the situation now. Bomb technicians are checking out as many as 2, possibly 3 suspicious packages that have been found in City Hall. The mayor and council believe in all likelihood this is simply a hoax, but given the events today in the United States, they aren't taking any chances.
It was a difficult decision. I went down and asked council to move into the bunker.
But security felt even the bunker could be dangerous, so councillors cut short their weekly meeting and reconvened in front of City Hall. They were soon joined by other staff from the building. What's being described as 2 devices were found.
I'm sure there is nothing to be alarmed about, but you must react and take every threat seriously, and that's what we're doing today.
Yes, it could be a copycat, but a copycat could be a very serious explosion.
Police removed 2 packages. Martin Salome felt vulnerable after he found out something was wrong. The Chamber of Commerce general manager was on a flight from Edmonton to Yellowknife when the pilot said he had to turn around.
Did a very quick 180 and we started heading back. They weren't able to tell us what happened, so we were all left to speculating for about 45 minutes till we got on the ground.
I'm terrified.
Callers to Edmonton radio talk shows said they were sickened and outraged by the attack.
There's been enough killings of innocent people. Exactly. Those people that were in their office this morning when those planes flew through their buildings, they didn't deserve that.
What's happening now with most people is that they're really pissed and people want to lay blame really quickly, which I think is very, very dangerous.
Information was in short supply. People just couldn't get enough. This bank of TVs in the downtown core held a steady audience. They watched in shocked silence, shaking their heads in disbelief.
It's pretty sad. All these people have to die. You know, they were saying like 50,000. It just makes the Oklahoma one, makes it look like nothing. It's terrible, it's sad.
When I first heard it on the radio this morning, I thought it was a joke. An incident like this, I didn't think it was real. You know, sort of like the old Mars attacks sort of thing. So, but then I thought I better go and have a look and see what's going on here. So, what do you think of the firefighters on the scene? It's pretty scary.
Updating these suspicious packages, police have attempted to open one of them with a water cannon. It didn't quite work. They'll be trying again momentarily. They have another package that they have brought out of City Hall, and now they tell me that there is possibly a 3rd package that is located in a men's washroom. They expect to be down here dealing with this situation for maybe a couple more hours. Traffic has been tied up around the City Hall area on 99th Street and 102 Avenue. Traffic is very heavy right now, and they're asking people who don't have to be down here to avoid the area. Daryl?
As for the terrorist attacks, there's a great deal of empathy on the part of Edmontonians for our neighbors south of the border. People do get another way to express their grief and sympathy this evening, right?
That's right, Daryl. A number of churches around the city have decided to open up their doors to the public tonight. They'll be holding some special prayer sessions to help start the healing process. Daryl?
Sheldon Larman with that live report from just outside of City Hall tonight. In Calgary, several companies shut down today. As a precaution, the Calgary Tower was one of the first buildings to close its doors. There was a lockdown at the Hanover building. No one was being allowed in, and some companies told their employees it was time to get out. Police say all of the evacuations were simply voluntary. There were no specific threats. Security being scrutinized all across Alberta tonight. Premier Ralph Klein says that his ministers are working with Ottawa to ensure that this province's facilities and resources are secure.
We have a situation, as you know, in this country where we supply a large amount of the American energy needs. We have to look at the security of our oil and our gas industry and to make sure that whatever is necessary is indeed put in place to make sure that that industry is protected.
Klein also said today if this kind of terrorist atmosphere is present a year from now, then it would be foolish for the Canadian and Alberta governments to host the G8 summit in Kananaskis. Premier wrapped up saying that he woke up this morning thinking he was seeing a modern version of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. There is heightened tension all through our country today. It could also be found right on Parliament Hill.
Please, can you go in front of the building, please? Yeah, can you evacuate here?
Tourists were shooed away from the East Block of Parliament after a bomb scare. It turned out to be nothing, but no one was taking any chances today. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien condemned the attacks in the harshest language that he could muster and offered up his condolences.
I hope that Canadians will show their solidarity with our neighbors.
Canadian stock markets closed down. So did the CN Tower in Toronto as stunned crowds watched the unfolding tragedy south of the border. The reaction has been far different in the Middle East, at least parts of it anyway. Thousands of Palestinians were celebrating the attacks in the U.S. That was the scene in the West Bank town of Nablus. About 3,000 Palestinians poured into the street shortly after the attacks, celebrating, even as their leader Yasser Arafat said he was horrified and condemned the terrorist acts. Elsewhere in the world, the ruling Taliban in Afghanistan denied any involvement. They also say terrorist Osama bin Laden, who has been given refuge there, could not have been involved. Bin Laden has since issued a statement saying he did not have a role, but he did support the terrorist attacks. Other world leaders were unified in their anger, including Britain's Tony Blair.
Security has been increased across the full range of government buildings and military premises. The police across the whole of the UK are on full alert.
Meantime, American officials say tonight they had nothing to do with this, an attack in Afghanistan. They say that fighting in Kabul appears to be rocket attacks by Afghan rebels who are opposed to the ruling Taliban. All these attacks certainly sparking concern around the world. People in Edmonton with family and friends in the chaos have been desperately trying to get information on their loved ones. Our Valerie Oskowski joins us from the Red Cross tonight, where a lot of people have been going for help.
Daryl, the Red Cross is typically the agency you think of in a time of crisis, and a number of people here in Edmonton feel that time is right now. They're desperately trying to find information on friends and family in New York and Washington. Karambir Minhas's niece works in downtown Manhattan.
So she's not at home, so she must be there.
Just a stone's throw from where the World Trade Center used to be.
You just kind of holding your breath, just hoping everything's okay?
Yeah, and so that we can tell her father that she's fine.
While the phone is usually our first line of communication, TELUS urges you to consider other modes of getting information, especially when all the world is trying to get news out of New York and Washington.
Unless it's a dire emergency, please don't call. You can try the internet. I myself did receive an email this morning, so there is some internet traffic getting through.
Good morning, Red Cross.
Your other information option is the Red Cross.
Our primary role in a disaster, Valerie, is reuniting families. We want to bring people back together. So what we would do is take information from people. If they are looking for family, friends down in the affected area and they can't connect with them, we would take some information and work very closely with the American Red Cross and see if we can bring people back together.
The Red Cross has 2 numbers to pass on. If you're looking for information on Americans in Washington or New York, you're asked to call their Red Cross office at 423-2680. Now, as far as information on Canadians over there, you are asked to call the Foreign Affairs Office at 1-800-387-3124. Reporting from downtown Edmonton, Valerie Oskowski, CFRN News.
Thanks, Valerie. An Alberta model who's been working in New York watched all the drama unfold this morning. Paul Green is from Wetaskiwin. He was just a few blocks away from the World Trade Center when the attack hit. He had to walk for over 4 hours just to get home to his Queens apartment. Says the streets were just crowded with people who were stunned.
People were quite, I think, numb. No one's going to realize this until a few days go by and we start to really see what happened, you know? But it was just incredible. No one's phones were working. Nobody had cell phones. Everyone was buying any radios they could get so they could hear what was happening with those other hijacked planes. And every time we heard a plane go over, everyone looked up and fearful of what it was.
Several other Alberta models also in New York. They are all safe tonight. Meantime, another prominent Edmontonian right in the middle of Manhattan this morning when the attack hit. The New York Rangers were to begin their training camp at Madison Square Garden, and a number of them, including Edmonton's Jamie Lundmark, were at Pennsylvania Station signing autographs. That was just a few minutes away from the World Trade Center. As frightening as that is, the news for Lundmark is good. He's just fine, but talked to his girlfriend this morning, and you can understand that they were shaken up.
Worked it out, puck fired towards a goal, scores!
I had asked him what it looked like, and he said that the dust was blowing down there and that it just looked like a war outside, and he was pretty scared, and he said he wanted to get out of there, but no one could leave the city or anything, so he was pretty shaken up about it.
Landmark's father, also in New York, also believed to be okay tonight. It has been a tough day for many American citizens who live here in the capital region. That includes members of Edmonton's professional sports teams. Members of the Edmonton Eskimos were glued to their TV sets before practice today. A lot of players have been trying to reach family members who live within the New York area.
I haven't talked to my mom yet. I mean, the phones are still down. A lot of heavy calling going around in the States right now. So I have to wait until after practice or a little later. Hope I got a message when I get home.
It makes you think, like, man, do I need to be on the phone all the time? Some of the guys are in the locker room right now, not really feeling like they want to practice at this moment because there's really more important things going on right now.
By the way, Neil Green's family lives in Yonkers, New York. It's about 20 minutes from Manhattan. Pretty hard to imagine how medical workers are coping, so many wounded to care for. We talked about that a little earlier in the broadcast. Medical watch reporter Molly Finley joins us now. You've been in contact with doctors who say they are already ready to lend their expertise.
Yes, Daryl, I have been. I spoke to doctors today experienced in disaster relief and connected to workers in New York. It's hard for them to fathom the task ahead. And of course, they're all shocked by this extraordinary loss of life. It's the stuff of nightmares. Thousands of evacuees, wounded, and those who can't even be reached. Dr. Noel Gibney has worked in disaster zones from Kosovo to Cuba, but he's never seen anything like this before.
Best description really is of a battle zone. At two levels. One, they have to extricate the survivors from the debris, and then secondly, put them somewhere where they can be assessed and triage, battlefield triage effectively applied.
New York City streets are now massive triage zones, with staff deciding on surgery for those who might make it and those who won't. Meet the man known as Dr. Quake, an eminent disaster relief expert. He says there's a method in all this madness, starting with search and rescue for survivors and using bystanders to help.
The heroes are people who have no special training but just happen to be on the site and were able to help in that.
And they can be a part of the infrastructure, the big plan of recovering from this kind of disaster.
Yes.
Hospitals in Ottawa and Toronto are getting set to receive patients from New York. So far, our Capital Health Authority hasn't had any such request, but they do say they'll be ready if the call comes.
We've actually been asked to look at our capacity in intensive care and in the burn unit in case it's necessary. But at this point, again, we don't have any formal requests for any assistance.
And this disaster is so destructive that a plea for our city's help may not come at all.
Today I've talked to lots of physicians working in the cities where this happened, and they're not overwhelmed. And the reason is that a lot of the affected people have not survived.
I think it's one of severe shock, almost despair at times, that this could actually happen.
That it's such a tragic loss of life?
That's right. This is a terrible, tragic event.
The doctors I've been in touch with have received emails from other parts in New York. They say they're too numb. Numb is too weak a word to describe how they feel, and that they'll be expecting a very long night ahead.
Indeed. Thank you. Molly Finley reporting in the studio tonight for us. Canadian Blood Service is busy already. Edmontonians heading to the agency at twice the average rate so that they can get a hand in and help out. Agencies also hoping that others will also come forward to donate blood. They need it now and over the next few weeks to make sure that there is a steady supply. You can call 1-800-2DONATE in order to set up an appointment. A lot of Edmontonians in a state of disbelief tonight. We've been talking about throughout this broadcast. Despite the distance from the tragedy in the U.S., people in our city may actually be traumatized by today's terrorist attacks. Mental health professionals say it rather helps to share your feelings, talk about it.
Particularly in this acute post-traumatic period, it is good for people to talk with family and colleagues and your kids about it.
Fears today's events will change the sense of security many North Americans have enjoyed.
I work with them. I can tell you right now, if you took every single mental health professional that had experience in this and you put them on this, you'd only meet about 1/50th of the need. This this is going to leave a tremendous amount of unresolved emotional scarring.
If you decide you need help dealing with the crisis, you can call the Alberta Mental Health Line. That number is 1-877-303-2642. The terrorist act was certainly the topic of discussion in a lot of Edmonton area classrooms today. Rob Williams is on that story and joins us live from the News Centre tonight. Students are certainly shocked, Rob, but they're also wondering what happens next.
Daryl, we walked into Paul Kane High School in St. Albert today. Students were crowded around TVs in the hallway. It was the same scene in a number of classrooms. They cannot believe what they saw, and many tonight left asking why.
Everybody's just shocked.
A somber feeling sets in as students watch the terrorism unfold right before their eyes.
I just don't know how someone could do that and live with themselves after doing something that drastic to the country, you know?
We had the Pentagon hit once. We had
a remote replaces a piece of chalk in Diane Brayman's Social 30 class. Her students keep an eye on the live coverage as they talk about this horrible tragedy.
They lost something that was so important to them, and they want someone to blame. They want someone to put their anger on.
They're going to find out the death tolls first. They're going to find out everything before they start and just go and blowing stuff up. I guarantee you they won't just go willy-nilly.
But you just can't say, I'm going to go bomb this place and this place only, because then you're doing the exact same thing and killing innocent civilians.
The free-floating anxiety, the stress an event like this creates for kids is across the board.
This school counselor admits kids will have a tough time dealing with what they see and hear, but urges parents to help ease the pain by watching the news with their children and encourage them to talk about what's on their mind.
Listen, appreciate that this is a time when a handhold, an arm around, is much more important than a lesson to be taught.
Students like Adam Bradley fear this situation may escalate out of control.
Could we see a full-scale battle here? Oh, for sure, like the beginning of World War III, even like something this. It's just big, you know.
Now, experts have a few tips for parents of younger kids in that 8, 9, 10 years of age range. Let them know events like this are extremely rare and that it happened far away from our city. As well, for parents, keep your household routines intact. Supper and bedtime should be the same as they usually are. Reporting live tonight, Rob Williams, CFRN News.
Thank you, Rob. It has been an extraordinary day, and the magnitude of today's events prompted Edmonton's 2 daily newspapers to crank up the presses a little early. The Edmonton Sun put out a special afternoon edition with photos and a full account of the tragedies in New York and Washington. It's the first time they have ever released an afternoon run. The Edmonton Journal also put out a special newspaper devoted entirely to the American disaster, also believed to be the first time the Journal has released an afternoon edition ever since it moved to morning edition several years ago. A handful of Edmonton businesses closed down today in the wake of those tragic events in the U.S. People looking for their afternoon Starbucks fix were turned away. The American-based coffee giant closed all of its stores in Canada, including all 10 in Edmonton, done out of respect for the victims of today's catastrophe. All of them will be back in business tomorrow at their regular opening time. Some other local stores, like Eddie Bauer and the Bombay Company, also closed in light of today's developments. A local businessman is helping a United Way campaign to support people impacted by today's events in a most generous manner. The head of Williams Gas Pipeline, Cuba Washington Jr., has made a $1 million donation to start this fund. If you'd like to add to that, you can call 424-6176. Now tonight at 11:30, Kim Taylor will return with updates on all of our local stories, including the death of one-time Edmonton Oiler Garnet Ace Bailey on one of the planes that slammed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. U.S. President George W. Bush is about to address the U.S. and the world, and we're going to head back to CTV's coverage of the terrorist attacks. First, we're going to give you a recap of all the phone numbers that we've given you tonight. Thank you for watching. We'll check in with Lloyd Robertson again in just a moment.
And receiving no answers, they probably did not. They would then have made several calls, and the next thing was that they would have sounded the alert. Too late, of course, there's nothing they can do. They would then have alerted the airline concerned in each individual case that there was something amiss with their airplane, such a flight, and no response. But let's not forget that all this happened in fairly quick time, from the time that the airplanes diverted from their flight path until the accidents occurred. So by putting these tapes, the air traffic control tapes, back together, they will establish a time frame. They'll have a good idea of the plan, if you want, of the whole exercise, as well as some good indications, I think, from the recovery of the black boxes in Pennsylvania.
Yes, indeed, those black boxes suddenly become critical and important. I take it there's no word yet from anywhere, and I'll ask this also of Mr. Hurley Pitts, who is with us, former head of the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board. No word on black boxes yet, Mr.?
Well, I wasn't with the National Transportation Safety Board. But
Pardon me, sir.
It's quite all right. I do believe that recovering those devices is going to be critical. It'll also let them have an insight into what happened on the other aircraft.
All right, back to you and also our other guest here. Now, just before we hear from the President of the United States, what's he going to say about people, or he probably won't say anything about this specifically, but how is he going to reassure the public that traveling is again going to be all right in North America and specifically in the United States over the next few days? What would you say in this kind of situation, Mr. Hurley Pitts?
Well, the first thing I would do if I were the President of the United States is announce increased security measures at the entry point to all aircraft, at the airports in general, to let the American people know that it is safe to fly. I imagine one of the tolls that we will have to calculate eventually is how many billions of dollars would have been lost today in the economy, not only in the United States, but internationally, because of the lack of air transportation. We must reassure people that it will be safe to fly. But that's going to be a tough job, and he's going to have to announce some pretty tough measures, and Americans are going to have to accept far more scrutiny at the airports.
Now, do you think under any circumstances that people will, tomorrow morning, they'll be heading, some of them will undoubtedly head back out to the airports, but what's your guess on when air traffic might resume in North America from your own knowledge of security situations?
Well, my experience would tell me that there will be limited flights taking off tomorrow, and that within the week, America will return to full air transportation. I think one of the things that the United States will be very anxious to do, and certainly Mr. Bush, is to put the American economy back on path, to let terrorists know that there is nothing that they can do that will deter people from a normal life, even if that means extraordinary measures.
Now, what kind of extraordinary measures might that entail?
Well, I think people are going to have to get used to, certainly American airports, if not internationally, being checked for gunpowder, being swabbed, having it checked through an analyzer, dropping off their luggage far more in advance than they do now. There's going to be longer waits at airports. I think there's going to have to be longer walks to the gates themselves. I think in airports like Logan, where I was just this August, no longer will family members who are not going to board the flight be able to sit with others that are ticketed in the waiting area. I think there's going to be far more security measures and multiple levels of security throughout the airports, throughout the United States, if not internationally.
All right, thank you very much, sir. We are now awaiting the arrival of George Bush at the White House. He's in the White House, but in the Oval Office, where he will address the American people. This is the moment of testing, of course, for the relatively new American president. Ari Fleischer, his press secretary, has said that the message will be one of resolve and reassurance, a reassuring message that our nation has been tested before and our nation has always prevailed. That will be the tone of the message, according to his press secretary. Well, we will see, because all of the electronic frequencies all over the world at this particular hour are undoubtedly tuned in to George Bush at the White House in Washington. I believe we have a picture of him here now, the U.S. president. President Bush, waiting for the various television networks, obviously, to get on side here at a specific time of about 10 seconds from now, and then he will be cued to begin speaking. So here he is.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you, good night, and God bless America.
A statement perhaps surprisingly brief from President George Bush from the Oval Office in the White House, indicating that there will be no distinction made between the terrorists who committed these terrible acts today and those who harbor them, which could be seen by some people to indicate a threat against those countries who have been said to harbor terrorists in the past. He indicated also that He's in deep despair for the wounded and the dead, of course, and the despair, this just desperate act of terror that took place today will not go unanswered. He said the usual things. Craig is on the line with me from Ottawa. Craig, any surprises there for Mr. Bush?
No. I thought it was a somber, moving, and very effective address, made even more effective by the brevity of it. I think the important line was the one you picked out, which could be very bad news for the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, because that is clearly who he was thinking of when he said, we will make no distinction between those who harbor evildoers and those who they are. You know, one of the things that strikes me tonight is, and I'm recalling now a long time ago, when London was the victim of terror from the skies. And one of the lessons of the Blitz was that it unified Britons and strengthened their resolve. And he seems to be calling on that sort of thing himself. And this may be one of the effects on this in terms of American public opinion, that it unites Americans in the same way as the Blitz united Britons and Londoners at a very tough time.
Yes, that seems to be a common message that world leaders send out at this particular time. But we've already heard from Mayor Giuliani and Governor George Pataki of New York State. They said that New Yorkers were pulling together at this time of crisis. They were helping one another. Yes, there was the chaos and the critical concern right after, but now certainly they're pulling together once again. Craig, this is always a time of testing for an American president. This is very early in George Bush's term. In what sense will he be measured by this? Or are people going to say, listen, this is very tough stuff. Let's give him a break. Let's not look at the polls tomorrow to see how the president performed under these circumstances.
Americans always rally behind a president at a time of crisis. There's never been a time in American history when they did not. But remember that Bush has already had a very substantive test in terms of his deft ability to handle a major policy crisis, and that was when the American Air Force plane was forced to land in China. That could have blown into a very serious crisis with the Chinese. He handled that in a cool, deft way, and that was more than just show. That required clever diplomacy, and I think a lot of people were impressed by Bush's performance in that one. So I don't think it should be a surprise tonight that he seems, at least at the end of this day, to perform very well at a time when Americans need a man to speak their sorrow and their determination to, in effect, get even.
What will happen tomorrow now in Washington?
Well, I think that he may be a little more optimistic than reality in terms of the economy. This was very much an attack on the American economy, not just on the American people. The Target, that building in New York City, houses 50 floors of investment houses. I don't know whether the stock market is going to open tomorrow. The world economy was teetering on the brink of a recession, and it is very possible that this could be enough to push the economy over into it. I think that this will have an economic impact in the coming days, and that will be one of the aims of the terrorists who did these acts.
Yes, you have to wonder, Craig, whether the terrorists who committed these acts today did in fact see the trouble in the U.S. economy and indeed in the world economy, and use this opportunity to strike hard and fast, although obviously the planning that went into this would have taken some length of time.
Yes, but they chose these targets very carefully. The great symbol of American economic power, the World Trade Centers, and then the symbol of American military power, the Pentagon. We may find out later that they were planning to go for the White House too. But just those two were obviously clearly no accident. They were carefully chosen targets, symbolic of everything America represents.
Once again, we're watching a video, Craig, from earlier in the day of the crash of the American Airlines plane and then the second one into the World Trade Center tower. Pictures that will be played and replayed and replayed over the next 24 hours and will live within our own memories forever. This September 11th, 2001, a day in infamy and a day which all of us will recall once again, as happened with the Kennedy assassination years ago, where we were at the moment when we heard of this terrible act. Now, what sort of, going back to the American president situation, what sort of tone will he be striking over the next couple of days, do you think? Will he go out to visit the injured and families and this kind of thing?
I would think so. He will visit hospitals. He will be, at this point, a humanitarian president offering solace to those who've been hurt rather than a beefy military president at this point. That will come a little later, especially once American investigators get a better track, which they surely will, on who committed these acts as they begin to gather evidence.
Thanks, Craig. Michael O'Hurley-Pitts is still with us here in Toronto, and he has some observations, obviously, on the president's speech, because he was speculating about what the president might have to say tonight in terms of reassuring the American people. Our security expert and intelligence expert. Michael, tell us, first of all, in general terms, what did you think of the speech?
Well, I think it was somber. I think one of the things that President Bush did was took a sheet from President Theodore Roosevelt some 100 years ago. Speak softly but carry a big stick. I think many Canadians are still alive to remember President Kennedy's speech when he spoke of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the real clear and present danger to the United States, if not North America. He didn't go so far as to lay out a strict line which terrorists may not cross, but he made it very clear that the U.S. will not abide by any nation, any community harboring these terrorists. I think silence is acquiescence in the law, and he's made it very clear that anybody that harbors them in the least will suffer the full consequences of his action.
How will that statement be interpreted around the world in the various capitals?
Well, I think one of the things that happened tonight was President Bush came of age. It's one thing to be elected president. It's another thing to appear presidential. I agree that he's looked presidential before, but I don't think quite like tonight. He went ahead to assure the American people that government will reopen, that our financial institutions are strong, that terrorism will not triumph. But by sending a clear message that the U.S. will resolutely not allow these people to escape justice, I think he sent a clear message that the U.S. will respond in the fullness of time once the facts are assessed. And I think that will be very reassuring to our allies who may have feared that the U.S. would have retaliated in an unmeasured tone. And I think it'll also send a clear message to the terrorists. They should look over their shoulders all the time.
Just on that point of getting the system up and running again tomorrow, Michael, this is going to be a huge job. All of those computers, the World Trade Center effectively destroyed, back to work in Washington, back to work in New York. We're going to bring in Alison Vuchnik, who's in Washington, overlooking the White House tonight, and she can tell us about just what the plans are there for tomorrow. Alison, what about it?
Well, as you heard the president say, he said tomorrow will be business as usual. And as you can imagine, a lot of the government workers who live here, this is the first time that they've heard that news. Up until the president spoke, they were not sure if they were going into work tomorrow. He obviously wanted to deliver a very powerful speech. But you have to imagine that for some of those people, there are mixed emotions. Some of these people don't know where their colleagues are. Some of them still don't know where their loved ones are. So whether all of them will actually report to work tomorrow will have to be seen.
And then there is the enormous problem of getting the system up and running again. How do you do it? Are there backups for what goes on at the World Trade Center? One assumes there might be. Michael?
Well, I think, having lived both in New York and Washington, D.C., I think there are enormous infrastructure concerns here. Is the subway system safe? It is at the lower part of Manhattan. The rest of the subway system should be safe, but there are security concerns there as well. As far as Washington's concerned, the United States Congress needs to return to work. I think that there will continue to be a military and police presence in Washington, D.C., but it's unlikely that New York will return to business as usual very soon. If everything south of Canal Street has been evacuated, I think what we'll see is the financial centers moving to New Jersey. Many have moved over to Newark in the last few years with satellite offices. And with telecommuting, if we can get the networks back up and running, I don't think we should see the kind of impact that we may have 10 years ago. In an odd way, we may be better suited to go through this process today with the kind of technology available, with people working from remote locations, than we were ever before. I think that the big thing for the government is to show that they can reestablish infrastructure and normalcy as soon as possible. It'll be difficult.
Yes, that'll be the main question, of course. How did the various emergency services respond to today? Were they ready for this? We all remember, those of us who were around in the 50s and the early 60s, we certainly all remember those warnings in the Cold War about bomb shelters and how to handle your family, how to handle your personal situation at any time there was a warning about a possible nuclear attack. We've forgotten all about that, and now suddenly we know that life is fragile and that this kind of thing can happen any time, and that there is uncertainty in every chapter of life. So this is going to bring all of this home to us again, isn't it? As we look at these pictures, by the way, Michael, which are coming from Washington. These are the pictures of the Pentagon and the collapsed portion of the Pentagon building from earlier today. Michael, would you like to address that?
Well, I think one of the things that's going to happen here in the not too distant future, a lot of grandparents or older parents are going to sit down with their children and remind them of duck and cover, remind them of the air raid drills that were commonplace in North American schools up to the 1970s. I think we're going to have to re-embrace the idea that we no longer live in a secure society. When we see the kind of damage at the Pentagon, it's that very symbol of American power. When we see the kind of destruction in Lower Manhattan, I think it sends a message to everybody that we need to be more vigilant. And if the price of that is understanding emergency preparedness better, I think it's a price we're going to have to pay. And I think that we can do that in relatively short term, but I think it's going to take the agencies working together. One of the things I would say is here in Canada, agencies are much more integrated. They share information and resources far more often than U.S. agencies. I think one of the tests for the Bush administrations over the next few weeks will be how the different agencies work together to bring about a better and improved infrastructure and security in the United States.
All right, Michael, thank you very much. Don't run away because we'll be coming back to you a little later. Right now, we want to go on the phone to Rhonda Odesky, who is from Montreal. She's a psychiatrist who was visiting New York today, and she has undergone a number of personal experiences there today involved with this tragedy. Hello, Ms. Odesky. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Lloyd.
Tell us what you've been doing today from a professional standpoint about helping people through these difficult times.
Well, I actually went to the American Red Cross to volunteer as a mental health professional. I'm actually a clinical psychologist. I work at the Hadassah Hospital in Israel, treating bomb victims there, and so this is actually my field of expertise. And really what we do is we try and help normalize the situation for people, a very non-normal situation, but we normalize the symptoms. Everybody who witnesses such an event experiences an acute stress response, meaning they have an automatic nervous system arousal, fight-flight response. They may have startle response, difficulty sleeping, flashbacks, nightmares. These probably will happen later on. Today, it was just trying to calm them down because their nervous systems were so aroused given what they witnessed. The loss, the grief, it's overwhelming for many people. So the Red Cross was trying very hard to get mental health professionals into place. They're setting up shelters to try and counsel people at this time, and it's going to be going on. They're doing 2 shifts a day, and it's going to be going on now for the next several days. The hospitals, I was at one of the local hospitals, they're focusing obviously more on the physical trauma, but the emotional trauma, the grief is definitely going to set in the next few days as well.
Now, when you confronted some of these people today, how did you find them? Were they disoriented? Were they panicky? Were some of them coherent?
Generally, after a trauma like this, it depends on the person, but yes, people are definitely in shock. Some are incoherent, dazed. Some are unclear as to where they are. Other people are just hysterical, crying. People often are very confused. It's very, very difficult to witness such an event and to continue on in normal fashion.
That's right. And as you're speaking, we are looking from some pictures earlier in the day. This is home video, And this person, whoever he was or she was, I believe it was a he because we heard this person speaking on camera earlier today, got right into the depth of the disaster, obviously just below the towers because we were seeing some of the debris falling from the buildings. How close did you get to the center of this?
I wasn't very close to the center. The closest I got down to was the 60s. So I could see the smoke, the clouds of smoke in the sky, but I didn't see any of the destruction. I did speak with a woman who was on her way to work. She works in a building across from the World Trade Center, and she got out of the subway station. And as she got out, the plane flew into the building. She was thrown to the ground and was covered by bodies that she couldn't tell if people had jumped out of the buildings or they had been, just because of the force of the explosion, had been just ejected, and bodies were falling on top of her. Fortunately, in some ways, because of that, she was bruised, but she was not badly injured because she was protected. Needless to say, she was quite hysterical, in shock, and very, very frightened, but not physically harmed in the way that, obviously so many people have been harmed physically and killed because of this.
It's now almost 12 hours since these events began to happen in New York City. What sort of sense of this day is settling in there now from the people you're talking to?
Well, I have to say I've never seen Manhattan this quiet. The streets are quite empty. There's a very somber mood. People are still walking, even people that haven't been injured or involved, but obviously are walking around in a sense of shock. You still hear sirens. As a matter of fact, you might hear it now. All the hospitals are surrounded by police, high security. You might hear those sirens going by.
Yes, we hear them.
And it's very sad. The loss is just enormous proportions.
All right, Ms. Zadesky, we thank you very much for taking time to talk to us because we know that you've been very, very, very busy today, and I know that the people you've been dealing with thank you for being there, and also thank you for your efforts in helping in this tragedy. Rhonda Zadesky, who is from Montreal, a psychologist who has been helping to counsel trauma victims in New York today. David Harris, our terrorism expert, is in our Ottawa studio. And David, just want to go back over the situation in Canada now for the next couple of days. What will be happening here?
Well, we'll be seeing a continuing and major heightening of the alert status of our defense forces and, of course, our security and intelligence forces. They'll be watching borders and they'll be watching transportation systems very closely. You can imagine that if the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, the RCMP, have had some suspicions about various individuals and groups in this country, there will be much, much greater surveillance undertaken. So altogether, alert status, a dangerous situation being watched.
So how does the average person behave in this kind of circumstance? If you're out and around tomorrow, you're traveling, you're perhaps going into the subway, how do you respond?
Well, I think for the time being, Canada probably isn't very high up on the list. And when I say to the time being, I just mean in the next few days. My impression is, and consistent with what terrorist groups tend to plan, is that they've got a major impact situation. They chose not just the United States, but some of the most traumatic targets imaginable in the U.S. At this point, I shouldn't see them branching out into Canada for any particular reason. I don't doubt that that kind of threat will eventuate for Canada itself in the continuing future, as we find our country increasingly infiltrated by terrorist organizations and networks.
David, Reid Morton is here with me. He's the former head of CSIS, the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service. Want to bring him in on this conversation. Talk about one point in particular, because this is what we're going to be trying to assess over the next couple of days. Just what kind of people and mentality are we dealing with here? What is the world confronted with? You first, David.
Well, you're dealing with a completely alien mentality. You're talking about a sort of medieval outlook on things that doesn't follow very frequently what most of us in the West recognize for rationality. There's a dogma, a devotion, a willingness to sacrifice life for a cause and everything else. This is something that's somewhat hard for us very often to anticipate because it is so alien as an outlook.
Reed, Morton?
Well, I think everything David says is absolutely correct. But what we have is that at the top of a kind of terrorist panoply, as you might say, are a group of people who have, maybe even beyond the kinds of things that David's describing, a real motivational force which is, you know, against things as opposed to being for things. It is against the kind of societies that we cherish so highly. It sees in our very liberal values a threat to a kind of a civilization that they would like to preserve. David's not so bad in saying, you know, there's a certain medievalism, there's a certain kind of rock-hard, crystalline fanaticism, zealotry that goes with this, and that's why what we see now, and you know, goes back to the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, for example. You find people with the motivation, doesn't matter what happens to them, it happens that they achieve the purpose that they want.
And particularly hard for law enforcement to deal with this kind of thing, and very difficult, David, obviously, for people in the free world to even understand this kind of mentality.
Well, that's right. I mean, we're full of our own conceits and hubris. We understand what we've lived with, and we've lived a pretty darn peaceable society. Most of us have no direct experience of warfare. The Second World War is the stuff of movies, as we've seen. But now, well, I'd say we woke up this morning and the universe changed, and we've got to change with it. We're going to be seeing some shifts in attitudes and probably some hardening in the discipline that we now have to bring to bear to the security of society. We hope that we can, of course, ensure the liberal democratic traditions will continue to flourish as much as everyone would hope.
That's right. This probably will be remembered, though, as a day when the plates of the world shifted a bit and we had to change our attitude about a lot of things.
This has been a shock treatment.
Right. Mike Eppel has been following the markets as they opened in Asia tomorrow morning, their time, and he also might speculate on when the markets might open again in North America. Mike, tell us what's going on.
Yes, indeed, Lloyd. The Tokyo stock market has resumed a normal trading day. They had a 30-minute delay at the start, but things are back to activity there. And the Tokyo Nikkei index is down 688 points right now. That's about 6.5%. And the market in Japan is down to the low. It's the first time it's been below 10,000 since 1984. So we're starting to see the catalyst effect here of the day's events in Manhattan at the world's financial capital, as it is known as. No trading yet in Hong Kong. What's going to be interesting to see is how the central banks of the world respond to this. There has been talk that the central bank of the U.S. will be cutting interest rates, loosening up the liquidity, allowing money to flow so that that's not a concern. Bank of Canada will be doing the same. Interest rates will be falling. You mentioned about the Wall Street situation. The Wall Street markets will be closed tomorrow. That has been confirmed. It's a question now, will they open probably next Monday? That's the speculation. Obviously, the World Trade Center was home to Morgan Stanley, among other companies, 40,000 employees. People worked at that complex. You just can't replace that. So that's had a dire impact on the financial area. The TSE will be holding a management meeting at 6:30 tomorrow morning. They will be issuing a statement between 7 to 7:15, whether or not they will be resuming business on Wednesday. But once again, Tokyo stock market down to the lowest level since 1984. Lloyd?
Mike, one question for you before you go. What can someone like the estimable Alan Greenspan say to calm nervous investors at times like this?
Well, it's a good question. He's going to have to come out and say, look, we're going to do everything that we can do to keep the financial sector running as normally as possible under these circumstances. So they will be cutting interest rates. The question is, though, does this automatically throw the U.S. economy into a recession? Up until this point, it had been teetering on the brink. There were some that were saying, analysts saying that the U.S. economy may be on the road to recovery later this fall. Obviously, when you shut down New York City and indeed the United States and the borders between Canada, Mexico, and airline flights around the world, this is going to have a tremendous impact on the state of the economy, the auto sector, the airline industry itself, oil and gas, you name it. So it's going to be very interesting to see his comments when indeed the U.S. Federal Reserve meets to or convenes to have a meeting and make some sort of an issue to perhaps calm things down. But right now we are seeing selling pretty much across the board overseas.
Mike, thank you very much. We'll be following you again tomorrow when things open up again, or at least we find out exactly what's going to happen tomorrow. Mike Eppel, CTV business editor. Matt Cowan, our Los Angeles correspondent, is on the scene in L.A. tonight, the entertainment capital of the world, of course. Matt, what about the mood there after this kind of scene?
Well, this morning I think that people really didn't know what to think. They woke up to the realization that their country had changed forever. And there was a movement. You know, a lot of people woke up to the, announcement that there had been an explosion at the World Trade Center, and then saw the second one live, and then started hearing about the Pentagon and the plane that went down near Pittsburgh. So I think that there was a lot of questions earlier about whether this was going to continue on. After that, I think the focus has certainly been just, well, people have been in a state of shock, really. And I was at the airport today. It's a ghost town. It's only security officials and some journalists some of the journalists who haven't been kicked out. So one of the things that you can tell that this is, that even the business of entertainment has totally ground to a halt earlier. So it's one person I spoke to earlier said it's like nothing. The closest it's come has been the riots and some earthquakes as far as just wondering exactly what's going to happen. But right now I think there's a lot of people just feeling for relatives and people from who are still dealing with the crisis in New York.
Yes, and we understand, Matt, that in many parts of the entertainment community things have been grounding to a halt, because we know for a fact that the Emmy Awards this Sunday canceled. We don't know when the Emmy Awards will play, as a matter of fact. They were to be here on CTV on Sunday night. We know that the Toronto Film